been to see us a few times before, and he's here to give us a little tutorial on ranked choice voting so we can all be super smart when we go to the polls next Tuesday and make the right choices and do it correctly. So take it away.
Well, thanks, Lisa.
Speak up, Kyle.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about ranked choice voting. It's something that I've been working on for the last 3.5 years. I didn't expect to be working on it still, but here we are, and we'll talk about why that is. So how many are you familiar with ranked choice voting or have heard about it? Great, okay, everybody. How many of you know you're going to be using ranked choice voting next week in the primaries? Great, all right, so we have a well-informed crowd. So Maine voters, as you may recall, and some of you participated in the election, we actually voted on this issue in November of 2016. It was the presidential election year. Mainers approved ranked choice voting, 52% of the vote, a majority vote, and it's actually the second largest vote of the Maine people in Maine's history of referendums. We had almost 400,000 Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, and Libertarians voted to have ranked choice voting because we wanted a system where our candidates were elected with a majority and not a plurality. We wanted to be able to vote our hopes and not our fears, and to eliminate vote splitting and the spoiler effect and some of the negative things that happen in campaigns when you have multiple candidates running under the old system. So I want to explain just a little bit about how we got here, how ranked choice voting works, and how you'll be using it in the primaries next week. And then I want to stop and really have a conversation, because I'm sure some of you have heard differing pieces of information about ranked choice voting, so I want to try to address questions, concerns that you may have. Hey, how are you? Come on in. So the Maine legislature and Governor LePage have repealed or fundamentally altered all 4 of the ballot questions that were approved by the Maine people in November of 2016. 2 of them were completely repealed, including ranked choice voting. 2 of them were significantly altered by the Maine legislature. This is really the first time in our history where we've seen the legislature, they have at times tweaked legislation passed by voters or made amendments to it, but never have they completely rewritten or gutted or got rid of initiatives in the way that they have now. And it's very concerning because up until this point, there has been a understanding that laws enacted by the Maine people have a special place, right? That there's something sacred about those laws, that we the people, when we go to the ballot box and approve something, it's not a suggestion to the legislature or a, golly, I hope you'll consider doing this because we want this. We're actually enacting a piece of legislation. And so this marks the first time that politicians in Augusta have said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't care what you think. We're just going to do what we want to do. And that's, to me, very scary. Because, one, why are we voting on issues in the first place if the politicians in Augusta don't care what we think? And 2, what does it mean that they're not listening to us? And if we allow them to continue to repeal laws that are approved by Maine people, where does it stop? And so what we are doing with a people's veto for ranked choice voting on the June 12th ballot is to stand up to the Maine legislature and Governor LePage and to insist on using ranked choice voting, that this is the system that we approved in November of 2016 at the ballot, and it wasn't a suggestion. We meant it when we voted for it, and we want to change the way we elect our politicians, because whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or independent or green or libertarian or actively engaged in politics or not, most of us really feel like our politics isn't working very well right now, that it's not solving problems, that it's kind of ground to a halt, that big issues aren't getting tackled, that it's a race to the bottom to see how negative and how much money can be spent beating each other up. And so we've got to find ways to improve our politics because our kids and grandkids deserve a better system. And that's why voters really embrace ranked choice voting, and that's what this is all about. So I want to explain just a little bit about how it works and why it matters. So we're going to show a little election here. So when you have 2 candidates running for office and you go to the polls and vote for, under the old system, go to the polls and vote for one. Now if your favorite candidate, let's say, doesn't win, at least you know a majority of your friends and neighbors wanted the other candidate to win. But when a third candidate enters the race, or 4 or 5, which are really common in Maine elections, suddenly someone can win with 30%, 35% of the vote. And a lot of questions get raised. One, is that candidate actually supported by a majority of voters, or are they opposed by a majority of voters. We don't know because somebody can win with 35% of the vote and actually be opposed by 65% of voters, right? So it creates questions. And those campaigns become much more about, we've all seen this and experienced this, what do the polls say? I don't want to waste my vote. Who's the spoiler? And the conversations in our campaigns can become all about those strategic considerations and less about the issues and values and vision and the conversation we should be having about what direction do we want to go in. And it becomes a race to the bottom. And in those races with 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, the incentive for the candidates and their campaigns and the parties and PACs that support them is to energize their base, their 30% of voters or 35%, and beat the heck out of their opponents, and to drive down their opponents' favorables and drive up their unfavorables and try to win, squeak it out with 35% of the vote in a very negative election. With ranked choice voting, you can't do that. Ranked choice voting restores majority rule, so candidates have to reach beyond their base and appeal more broadly for support, and thus be accountable to voters more broadly. So let's just show an example of how this works. So Barbara and I are going to run against each other in an election, and all the votes are cast. Let's just say it's the old system, right? The pick one, first past the post. Two-way race. It's Barbara and I, and we're competing, and overwhelmingly, I'm going to hold this up against you. Nope, other way. Other way. There you go. Perfect. Just like that. 60% of you want Barbara.
Yay!
And 40% want me. So under the old system, right, the way we've been voting in the past, Barbara wins. Now, what happens when Lisa decides that she's going to throw her hat into the ring? So Barbara, if you want to turn around your piece of paper, and then Lisa, you want to hold that up. So suddenly it's a 3-way race. And I keep my 40% of the vote, but now Barbara and Lisa are vote splitting because they are like-minded candidates with like-minded supporters. So 35% of voters want Barbara, 25% of voters want Lisa, and my 40% sticks with me. So now I win the election. But there's a big question there because 60% of people voted for somebody else other than me. Do the voters really want me, or do they want one of you? And so ranked choice voting allows what's called an instant runoff process. So you rank the candidates instead of just picking one. So in this 3-way election, you get a chance to actually say, Kyle's my first choice, or Lisa's my first choice, or Barbara's my first choice. And on that ballot, you also get to rank a second choice. So people who like Lisa the best can say, Barbara's my second choice. And people who like Barbara the best can say, Lisa's my second choice. And what happens in that election is we look to see who is everybody's first choice. So in this election, 40% of voters like me as their first choice, 35% of voters like Barbara as their first choice, and 25% of voters like Lisa as their first choice. Now, in the old system, I'd win. But in the ranked choice system, we say, who is it actually that the majority of voters want? So we actually see who's in last place. So in this case, Lisa's got 25% of the vote, so she's eliminated. But if you voted for Lisa, your vote's not wasted. It's instantly counted for your second choice. So Barbara, you put your sign down, or Lisa. Now, Barbara, you turn back yours around. So suddenly, now what we find is that everybody who liked Lisa the best moved over to Barbara. So people who liked Lisa the best as their first choice made Barbara their second choice. So instead of feeling like your vote is wasted, we have an instant runoff between Barbara and I, and everybody who voted for Lisa as their first choice moves over to Barbara as their second choice. And now Barbara actually wins with 60% of the vote because that's the truer preference of what voters want. That's ranked choice voting. And what it does is it restores majority rule. So instead of me winning with 40% and a lot of questions raised about, well, are you actually the legitimate winner? Which, by the way, hampers my ability to govern. If I were elected with 40%, we actually know that Barbara has a mandate to govern and to lead, and that's what the consensus is of voters. And what happens in that election is, under the old system, if we were in that 3-way race, my goal would be to energize my 40% and beat the heck out of these two folks to keep down their numbers below me. But with ranked choice voting, what happens? I have to think about, and Barbara and Lisa all have to think about, well, I need to reach out to voters who may like one of the other candidates better. Because if I can't be their first choice, I want to be their second choice, knowing that I may need their votes to come to me in an instant runoff in order to build a majority coalition and win. So suddenly, instead of just catering to my constituency, my base, I have to go knock on doors and talk to people who like Lisa the best and say, if I can't be your first choice, I'd like to be your second choice. Let's have a conversation about where we agree and disagree. How oftentimes these days do we find that candidates are echoing their base? right? And they're not actually having conversations or reaching out to more voters broadly, because what you want is people who are elected to office who don't just think about their base, but who think about being accountable to voters more broadly, and that filter the conversations in their mind of, well, you know, I had this conversation with a voter in Dover Foxcroft, and they disagreed with me on that. And, you know, they had some legitimate reasons for why they had that point of view. I need to factor that into my decision making. That happens less and less in our politics, and ranked choice voting helps to change that equation because it changes the campaigns and the way they run, and helping candidates win more broadly. So this is what that ballot looks like in a ranked choice voting election, this three-way race. So you get a chance to rank the candidates from your favorite to your least favorite. So in this example here, candidate A, B, and C, you really like candidate B the best, so you go to the first choice column, down to B, and fill in the oval next to their name. And in this race, you like candidate A as your second choice. They were kind of your backup. And if you couldn't have B, you like A. So you go over to the second choice column and fill in the bubble next to candidate A as your second choice. And you can rank a third choice if you like in this race or not. It's totally up to you. Your vote will never count for them. Your vote only counts for your second choice if your first choice is the one who's eliminated in the runoff, right? Otherwise, you're sticking with your favorite candidate. So, as we discussed, the Maine legislature and Governor LePage repealed ranked choice voting in October of last year. Supporters of ranked choice voting immediately filed what's called a people's veto, which is our ability to, under the Maine Constitution, stand up to the Maine legislature and actually repeal something that they repealed. So we actually get to push back and restore a law that they got rid of. The last time we did this was in 2011. There was a referendum on the ballot for same-day or election day voter registration. Maine has had a law for decades allowing you to register to vote on election day. That law was gutted in 2011, and Maine people stood up with 59% of the vote and restored that law. That was a people's veto just like this one. So voting yes on question 1 on June 12th allows you to stand up to the politicians in Augusta and protect ranked choice voting and insist that the will of the people be heard. And so that's what I'm here today to talk about, and also to let you know you'll have a chance to rank your candidates in voting in the Democratic-Republican primaries. Next week when you go to the polls, there are 7 Democratic candidates running for governor. There are 4 Republican candidates running for governor. That's the only race that you and Gorham will have a chance to rank your candidates on, because it's the only election you have where there's more than 2 candidates running. In the 2nd congressional district, so Lewiston North, those folks will also have if you're on the Democratic side, will have a congressional ranked choice voting primary as well, but we don't have that in the 1st district. So I brought some literature here. All of you should have, or there's some floating around. A little piece of information here just about ranking your choices. I know it's a little bit small. There is a sample ballot on here. There's also a sample ballot on this page as well. It's also small. I've ran out of my large blow-up copies of the sample ballot, so I apologize. But there's some more information here about ranked choice voting. I also brought some bumper stickers as well, so you're welcome to take those. And help us spread the word, because if you walk into the polling place next Tuesday not knowing that yes means protect ranked choice voting and no allows ranked choice voting to be gutted by the legislature, you may not know how to vote based on the wording of the question. It's not particularly clear based on the wording of the question. This isn't the first time this has happened. The people's veto I mentioned a moment ago on same-day voter registration also had a pretty confusing question. The Secretary of State gets to write the question. Our current Secretary of State isn't a fan of ranked choice voting as a policy, so I don't want to question his motives or intentions, but the question is not simple and straightforward. So yes protects ranked choice voting and the will of the people. So with that, I'll just stop, and I'd love to have a conversation, answer questions you may have, concerns. Yes, sir.
Why did the legislature oppose ranked choice voting, and what were the arguments against it?
So in the 2016 referendum campaign in which voters approved ranked choice voting, opponents raised 3 questions or concerns about ranked choice voting. I call them the 3 C's. One was cost, one was confusion, and one was constitutionality. They said ranked choice voting is unconstitutional, it's going to cost too much money, and voters will never figure out how to rank their choices. Well, we said and continue to say ranked choice voting is actually pretty simple for voters. You just say your first choice, second choice, third choice. You can rank as many or as few as you like, knowing that ballots are counted in rounds, last place candidates are eliminated until one candidate reaches a majority wins. It's pretty simple and straightforward for voters. So that the confusion piece, and we've seen it across the country, that voters who've used ranked choice voting actually like it a lot better than the old system. Cost. So what's called the fiscal note, which is kind of a budget that's attached to ranked choice voting. The 2016 referendum that voters approved had a budget that said, okay, ranked choice voting will cost $1.5 million to implement, and voters approved it. So since March, we've been in court 3 times with 3 different lawsuits to try to force implementation and protect ranked choice voting for the primary elections. What that litigation has actually discovered is that the true cost of implementing ranked choice voting for the upcoming election is less than $80,000. So, it went from $1.5 million to less than $80,000 in terms of the true cost of implementing this reform. So,
that's over and above what it would have cost.
What it
anyway.
would have first passed the post would have picked one race. Yes, so it's for statewide.
It's just an additional.
It's an additional $80,000 to implement ranked choice voting for the statewide election on June 12th. The other piece is constitutionality, which is one you may heard of. So opponents of ranked choice voting in the Maine Senate requested a solemn occasion of the Maine Supreme Court in 2017 around ranked choice voting. What they said was, we'd like to resolve some language that's in the Constitution that was put there in 1880 around what's called the plurality provisions. We need clarity on that. So if we need to pass a constitutional amendment to allow ranked choice voting to be used in all races, we need to know that. The Maine Supreme Court came back and said, yeah, we think that there might be a problem using ranked choice voting in 3 elections out of the 10 that voters approved in November of 2016. So the ranked choice voting law, as enacted by voters in November of 2016, called for using ranked choice voting in the primary elections for governor, state senate, state house, Congress, and United States Senate, as well as the general elections for those same offices. So those 10 races, right, were used under the original election. So the Supreme Court said, we think there's a problem with using them in 3 based on an amendment to the Maine's Constitution from 1880, which we can talk more about if you'd like. So we went to the legislature and said, okay, let's remove those 3 elections from the law and send us a constitutional amendment so voters can decide, do they want to use ranked choice voting in those 3 races. We've amended our Constitution something like 170 times in 200 years. So this is something that we do fairly regularly. The legislature refused to send us a constitutional amendment. They refused to bring ranked choice voting into constitutional compliance to protect the will of the Maine people. And instead, they repealed ranked choice voting in its entirety. And so we rose back with the people's veto and said, well, if you don't have the political will to address the concerns that have been raised, we will. So the people's veto for ranked choice voting restores ranked choice voting, keeps it for those 5 primary elections, governor, state senate, state house, Congress, and U.S. Senate, and also uses it in the 2 races in November for U.S. Senate and U.S. Congress. It will not be used in the governor's election, state senate election, or state house election in November until we pass the constitutional amendment. So that's the next step, is to have the legislature send us a constitutional amendment. But we'll never get that far unless we ratify the people's veto on June 12th to protect ranked choice voting and send a message to politicians that, no, we actually want a better system. No, we don't want you to just scrap our will. That there's no problem using ranked choice voting in 7 elections, so let's use it. Let's see how it works. Let's see if we like it. If we don't like it, we can always get rid of it, but let's give it a shot and see if it actually produces the benefits that we've discussed, from majority rule, eliminating vote splitting, making campaigns more civil, because you've got to reach out beyond your base and talk to voters who don't agree with you, knowing that voters can punish candidates, you can punish candidates with ranked choice voting who go negative by either not ranking them or ranking them low on your list, right? So there's a lot of good incentives there. Let's do what we've always done in Maine with deer ago, is lead the way. And that's what ranked choice voting allows. So that was a long answer to your question, but I thought I wanted to address all those. Yes?
Can they repeal, if we vote for the rank, can they repeal it again?
Technically, yes. Technically, the legislature can always go back and change the statute. But you should keep in mind, we'll have a new governor and we'll have a new legislature come January. I suspect that some of these folks will win under that system or have their favorite candidates win under the system, and it'll start to change that calculus. And I think people will see, well, the sky didn't fall. We've already debunked the confusion and cost arguments, and we've addressed the constitutionality piece. And what will happen is people will use it, and they'll say, oh, I kind of like that. I kind of like being able to vote my hopes and not my fears. And, I felt like it was a better process. And over time, it will become the new norm, right? Anytime there's change, it can be challenging, and the status quo can push back. But eventually we acclimate to that change, and then, if we really like it, we say, I really like that better. And that's what we found. Places that have adopted ranked choice voting across the United States, voters say they actually like it a lot better than the old system.
Will we be voting ranked choice at all during this election, other than for the ranked choice itself?
Yes, you're going to be using it in the gubernatorial primary.
That's what I thought.
That's right. So you're-
where's that gonna go? Because right now,
It's used. Yeah, it's the law. The Maine Supreme Court has already ruled that ranked choice voting is fully constitutional for the primary elections. There are no constitutional questions about ranked choice voting at this point for primary elections and the 2 federal offices for which the people's veto restores ranked choice voting. So opponents are still saying that ranked choice voting is unconstitutional. It's actually not true. The people's veto for ranked choice voting is fully constitutional. And in the last 3 months, both the Maine Supreme Court, all 7 justices in a unanimous decision, and the U.S. District Court for Maine have both thrown out constitutional challenges to ranked choice voting by opponents in the Maine legislature. Yes.
Where did the idea of ranked choice voting come from?
The current version of how we think about ranked choice voting comes from the late 1800s from a professor at MIT. It was the 1870s he developed the system. It popped up a lot in kind of the populist progressive movement in the 19-teens and 1920s. A number of cities used it, and it kind of faded away. Actually, Cambridge, Massachusetts has been using it for almost since that time, since the 1920s, I think. You've seen it kind of come and go. It just depends on, you think about that era. You had multiple candidate races. You had socialists and Bull Moose Party and those. So you actually, in response to having more candidates, they adopted ranked choice. And then we felt we kind of came into an era of 60, 70 years across the United States of just Democrats and Republicans. And so the need was lessened. But ranked choice voting is used all over the world. So Australia has used it since 1917 in their lower house of Parliament. And 6 different countries use it to elect their president, including Ireland. And they actually tabulate the votes by hand. They count all the ranked choice ballots and make piles, for the entire country. So it's been used for a long time, and you find that in parliamentary system it's been used much more regularly because they already have multiple candidate races, which is this. We're trying to address a challenge we have, which is, and I failed to mention this, but I alluded to it, is in 9 of the last 11 elections for Maine's governor, the candidate who won got less than a majority. And in 5 of those races, almost half, the candidate who won got less than 40% of the vote. So more than 60% of voters, kind of like our example, are voting for somebody else other than the winner. And so ranked choice voting helps to heal that process. And non-majority winners for governor in Maine include 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 2 independents. So this isn't about Democrats or Republicans. It's truly about giving voters what they want. So it puts you in the driver's seat to decide what is it that a majority of you want. Lisa.
So I wonder, we're gonna vote next Tuesday, ranked choice voting for the governors.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just say, what if no on one wins?
Mm-hmm.
Is that gonna throw the whole
No.
results of whatever happened in the primary for governor?
No, because ranked choice
into-
no, because the current law of the state of Maine is ranked choice voting until you get to decide again. So when we initiated the people's veto and submitted our signatures for ranked choice voting for another vote, it automatically froze the law in place that you voted for in November of 2016. So ranked choice voting is currently the law of the state of Maine, and it's the law of the state of Maine through I think the end of June. So and then whether if you decide that you want to uphold ranked choice voting with a yes vote, then we keep it going forward for primary and federal races. If a majority of voters happen to vote no, then it won't be used going forward, but it definitely holds for the primaries that are being used right now because it is the law.
Oh, I would think that would make it ugly. If that were to happen, if no were to win, I would imagine that the summer will be an ugly political time in Maine.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, I would just think that people would say, okay, we voted this out,
Mhm.
now all the results of the governor primaries.
Well,
There
so
are people that will twist it, is what
yeah,
I
I'm
think.
sure there will. There's people who always twist things. I'll say this though: the example that we used, where I was winning the race, even though majority wanted Barbara, or at least they were splitting the vote, only about 10% of the time does the candidate who is in second place, in this case Barbara, in that 3-way example, only about 10% of the time does Barbara overcome me and actually win. What you actually find is the person who has the most votes in the first round, 90% of the time, they still win the election. But you have a much different election. So instead of that beating down your opponents and pandering to your base, what you find is candidates reach out more broadly, they build a majority coalition, they listen to voters who don't agree with on the issues, you get to vote your hopes and not your fears, and you get to vote based on who you think will do the best job and not what the polls say. So really, what I say is it may change the outcome 10% of the time, it improves the process 100% of the time. And that's what this is really is about. And I know sometimes that's not, that may not be the most, attractive feature of something. It's a process reform. It's a structural reform. But if you want to change the outputs, you got to change the inputs. So if you want better government, a more responsive government, a government that listens to the people and solves problems, instead of just constantly doing this, then we need to look at ways to change the system to improve the process to get better outcomes. And that's what ranked choice voting is. Yes?
With our, let's say 7 or with multiple governor things, if it comes out like, you said the 40, whatever, first time through, when they go through the second counting, whatever, okay, if one person comes out with more than 50%, is that it?
Yeah, well, you can't defeat a candidate with a majority.
Yeah, okay, so you
So
don't
once somebody has a
keep going.
majority,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
win,
yeah.
right, mathematically.
Okay.
Yep.
I thought so, I just
Correct.
wanted to, yeah.
Yep, good question. So it could be that somebody gets a majority on the first round. So Portland's used ranked choice voting since 2011. In 2011, they had 15 candidates running for mayor. It was the first time in 80 years they'd had a direct election for mayor. So everybody who'd ever wanted to be mayor or had been mayor and wanted to do it again decided that they would run. And fortunately had ranked choice voting, because if they didn't, the candidate who won would have got 25% of the vote. And can't you imagine people would have said, oh my God, 75% of people didn't even vote for this person, right? So ranked choice voting allowed people to kind of rank their choices and come together in consensus. In 2015, when it was used again, there were 3 candidates. The current mayor actually got a majority on the first round, so they didn't even actually need to go through the ranked choice process. And that actually happens more times than not in these races if somebody gets a majority outright. But ranked choice voting is that protection to make sure that if there's not, we can achieve the consensus.
How long does it take to get the results?
Yeah, good question. So the way we currently have our system in Maine is we've modeled the ranked choice voting process based on the way we do recounts. So it'll take a couple of days to get the ballots centrally to a location for tabulation. So on election night, you'll know the results of the first choices. Who's everybody's first choice? That'll get published just like it is now, and it'll take several days to aggregate the number by the Secretary of State's office and tabulate and produce a final result. So at least by Monday, if not by Friday, the Secretary of State will announce the winner. We could do it more quickly. We could have an instant process, but the decision by the Secretary of State's office was not to go in that direction, at least for now. But what I think we'll find is that in the future, we'll speed that process up. Minneapolis, for example, is a city of 400,000 people. In their last November election, they had roughly the same number of people voting that we'll have next Tuesday in our primaries, and they produced the results of the election on the same night. They had like 400 precincts that they get results from. So there are definitely ways to make it faster, but right now you have to wait a few days. And if you want to have majority rule and address some of the challenges we're talking about here, you've got to have some sort of runoff election. So some places have an actual runoff election, where if there's multiple candidates and nobody gets a majority, you come back to the polls 4 weeks later for a whole new election, but to decide between the top 2 vote getters. So I'm originally from the state of Georgia. Georgia does that. I think there's a half dozen states that still do that. Lewiston does it in its mayoral election. And so, that's one possible route to go that in fact the League of Women Voters, who's been working on this issue for a long time, looked at. They compared that to ranked choice voting. And actual runoff elections restore majority rule as well, but it delays the result by 4 weeks. It tends to attract a lot of money from away on negative television ads because there's so few races that actually are in runoffs. So you get a lot more money spent on negative ads, and then you have to show up between Thanksgiving and Christmas for another election. And so it just drags it out more. And so ranked choice voting, in this case will take a couple days to know the results versus waiting 4 weeks with an actual runoff election. So it's the same mechanism, but an instant process, or automatic. Yes, sir.
Are the ballots actually counted by hand in Augusta?
No, so 91% of ballots right now in Maine are run through a tabulator.
Right.
So when you go vote in Gorham, it's the DS200. There's like 4 or 5 different Maine vendors who create these systems. Ours is called ESNS. And so you run it through, the ballot runs through, it actually scans an image, it puts it on a little secure USB drive. One copy stays with the clerk and one copy goes to the Secretary of State's office for that process. The hand count towns, the 9% of ballots are hand counted. In those towns on election night, they'll count the first choice rankings, and then they'll box up the 100 or 200 ballots that were cast, and they'll take them to Augusta to be run through a high-speed tabulator to process those ballots. And then the Secretary of State will aggregate the numbers statewide and tell us who's the winner of the Democratic primary or who's the Republican primary winner, unless somebody gets an outright majority. next Tuesday.
That'd be fascinating.
And the same system that we use in Maine, that we're using for Maine for ranked choice voting, the Secretary of State was involved in the Portland mayoral election 2015, where they actually did a test run of the existing hardware and software to scan these ballot images. We've already used it, test run it in Maine. And it's also the same system that Minneapolis uses to conduct their ranked choice voting elections, and they've been doing it for years. So.
So does everybody understand? This is the time to ask. Do you understand? When we go next Tuesday, you know what you're gonna do, you understand how that's the point of this. We
Yeah,
wanna make
and
sure that we understand
I know it's
how it
kind of
works.
small in here, and I apologize, but you can see the 7 candidates for governor on the Democratic side, and maybe I'll send Lisa a link to the ballots, and she can send them around so you can get a bigger image of them. But you've got 7 candidates running for governor on the Democratic side. You get a chance to say, I like this particular candidate as my first choice, my second choice, third choice. You get a chance to rank them the same on the Republican side. So you get actually a chance to try it and see if you like it, and then if you like it, you can vote yes on ranked choice voting on the ballot as well. It's on
Those
the.
two Dions related?
There's a Mark Dion and a Donna Dion. No, they are not related.
Mark Dion is the sheriff, or what?
Right.
It was the sheriff, and he's a state senator, and Donna Dion is the
Or you could
former
write
mayor of
me in.
Bedford. There you go. There's a write-in choice. There's a write-in.
Let's write in Virginia. That would be fun. Let's see how many.
You can also rank as many or as few as you like. So if you only want to rank 2 or 3 or 4, you can. If you want to just vote for one, you can. You can do that. It's called bullet voting. So you just go in and mark your first choice. I would discourage you from doing it. I would encourage you to rank your choices, because if your first choice can't win, you have a chance to have your vote count for your second choice. So, if you look at that race, say, of 7 Democrats running the gubernatorial primary, and you dislike all of them but like one of them, you can rank that one as your first choice and be done if you choose. And if you don't rank and your candidate's eliminated, it's just like if we had an actual runoff election 4 weeks later, and you decide you weren't going to show up and vote again because at that point you didn't care which one of those people won. You only liked your candidate, to heck with the rest of them. So you can do that, and nothing changes for you over the old system. But I would encourage you to rank. Yes.
What if you like only one candidate and you want to vote for them first and second choice? And you do
So
that?
you just want to go in and rank them as your first choice. The choices aren't rounds. It's just your choice as a voter. So your vote always counts for the candidate you're ranked highest. That's still in the race. So if your first choice is still in the running, they're not eliminated, your vote keeps counting for them round by round. Only if your first choice is eliminated does your vote move to your second choice in one of those instant runoff rounds. And by the way, if your second choice is eliminated, your vote moves to your third choice.
That's why it's important to.
Yeah.
Terribly, some of
Yes.
This is not on that subject, but with all the discussion about the Russians getting in, how safe do you think our machines are?
Well, so Maine has one of the best election systems in the country in terms of integrity. And so we have the paper ballot. We keep the paper ballot. The process we have for ranked choice voting has backup, so there's a digital scan that stays with the clerk, and the printed ballot stay with the clerk. So if there's any questions about the process or tampering or interfering, we always have the paper ballots to go back to. And the process is very safe and secure. There's so many processes and procedures in Maine for how those ballots are boxed up. We don't have electronic voting in Maine. It's all paper ballot. And so it's very difficult to tamper those elections. If there's,
So when we stick the ballot in the little slot,
yep.
that's not electronic. I mean,
It's just in a ranked choice election, it's just scanning that ballot, creates a digital scan, and that's what goes to Augusta for the ranked choice voting tabulation. But the paper copy you put in there stays locked in a box with the town clerk.
right.
And in fact, if we do need to do a recount, then the physical ballots are actually moved by the state police to Augusta to do that. So it's a very safe and secure process. And I get to ask this question a lot. It's an important one. So ranked choice voting, one of the things that I'm excited about is the data that gets published on the back end. So it's called a cast vote record, which is how did everybody rank their choices? So your combination was A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, C, D, whatever your order of rankings was. We don't know who cast that ballot, but it's actually a row on a spreadsheet of every single voter in the state of Maine. And what gets happened is that cast vote record gets put up online, and you can download it in an Excel spreadsheet and sort it yourself and see exactly how the winner was elected. So there's actually more data produced with a ranked choice voting election that produces some accountability. And there's also some great conversations that have happened as a result of ranked choice voting about auditing systems and putting more checks in place. So anytime you change systems, you get a chance to raise those questions. And so the League of Women Voters in particular is helping to drive that conversation to, make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect the integrity of our elections. So rcvmaine.com is the website for ranked choice voting. There's also morevoice.org. You can go watch videos about ranked choice voting, learn more. I encourage you to share some of the videos online with friends, post on Facebook, Twitter, email to friends. Let them know that they're going to be using ranked choice voting next Tuesday. It's really important that people have a chance to think about using ranked choice voting and know that a yes vote protects ranked choice voting. So if you can help us spread the word, that'd be hugely helpful. I appreciate you all so much having me here today, and it was great to talk to you. And I'll leave some additional literature as well. But thank you all so much for being engaged and showing up for this conversation and for voting next week, Tuesday.
Thank you.